So I'm a detective sergeant, and at the moment, as it says up there, I'm the staff officer to one of our assistant chief constables, Mr. Ayling. He is responsible for central operations, and within central operations comes the public protection unit. I have here one of my DCIs, Sam Mercer. She is responsible for domestic abuse within the public protection arena, strategically responsible for it. Obviously, the people out on the streets are governed by our local policing team, but she has the strategic lead for domestic abuse and sits under Mr. Ayling's team. I've been in the job now for 26 years. Most of that has been public protection. But at the moment, doing the job I do, I'm centred up on a command floor, and so I'm in one place at one time, and so I was easily accessible to be able to assist with the rollout of this trial. A lot of people do change, and certainly Mum's role, I've known 3 people in her position in the 12 months that I've been doing what I've been doing. So I was a consistent. I could be there and I could do stuff which perhaps was slightly more less strategic and more tactical perhaps, and so it took the weight off of the shoulders of the DCIs to do. I'll give you a little bit of an understanding, first of all, about how our forces separated, so that at least you can understand how we've rolled this out. And they kept talking about districts, and so at least you can see. So up here you have blue, green, and I'll call it pink. The blue area is our West Division, North is covered by green, and then you've got East in the county, which is all the purple. Each of those divisions is divided up into districts. We have 13 districts, and the eagle-eyed people will see that actually we only rolled out to 12 areas. And that's because Gravesham and Dartford came under one, so it just comes under one called Northfleet. So although we have 13 districts, it only went and got rolled out through to 12. We changed our way of policing, our model of policing, back in September 2017, where we looked at what was coming into the force, what was important to us. And the Chief Constable, Mr. Pewsley, decided that actually what we wanted to tackle from the heart going out was vulnerability. And so whilst we still have the response teams, so the guys and girls that go out in the patrol vehicles, answering calls, responding to emergencies, we still have a core section of those. We do have larger vulnerabilities, so our officers have been corralled in bigger numbers into our vulnerable investigation teams, and they are separated into 3 teams within one VIT. So that covers child abuse, adult abuse and domestic abuse. I would say probably the main portion of the work that comes in is domestic abuse, because it is a large portion of the work that we get sort of as a police force. But all of those teams will carry out their roles and can muck in with anything else. They're all in one area in terms of, when I say area, they're all in one office, but they're separated into their 3 teams. And so that's where we go. So vulnerability could be age, as in the adult abuse, it could be children, it could be domestic abuse, but obviously we look at other things such as mental health, the people's state of mind and condition when they were actually attacked or subject to whatever crime it is that has happened to them. But they are our three main posts in relation to the vulnerability team itself. As a little bit of background, just so that you can understand, in terms of recorded crime, since April of last year up until March, so it's not a full 12 months, it's just the 11 months, we have had 35,639 domestic abuse reported crimes to us. Now, that can be anything from stalking, controlling coercive behaviour, assaults, criminal damage. If it is reported as a domestic abuse incident, then it will go under that category. It also includes intimate and non-intimate. I don't have that breakdown. Again, I don't think it's important, but it gives you an understanding of where we're at and what we're dealing with. In terms of the safeguarding aspect, and I wanted to try and explain this to you because I wanted you to be able to understand where these cards fit in to this, the way we deal with our business. So safeguarding. The patrols that I've just spoken about will attend calls, emergency calls, 999 calls, or what we call as high-graded calls. We'll come into the control room and we will dispatch resources, patrols, uniform officers. When they attend, they will deal with whatever they see and however they think it is appropriate to be dealt with. In a very basic, simple term, you have two people, one's assaulted the other one, patrol officers will turn up. If they think it's proportionate and the appropriate thing to do, they will arrest one, and the other person they will deal with as the victim. They will sit the victim down and they will go through that process of getting a statement from them if they are willing to do so, giving them safeguarding information. And this is where the card would then come into the project rollout. Information that they would provide would be obviously relevant to their areas, because not everybody has exactly the same agencies and outreach workers available to them. But they would provide information to the victim in relation to what they could access. And this would be where they would say their piece in relation to the victim support cards. In addition to that, they would then look at whether or not we needed to have alarms going in, whether or not we needed operational information on a home address. So if somebody phoned in but was unable to speak and they just dialed 999, they would know by putting that address into our computer system that actually potentially it might be domestic related because somebody has previously had a domestic there and it's flagged up on our system. In addition to that, they should be, if there are children present during that incident, they should be contacting our central referral unit, which is mentioned just underneath. The central referral unit are a 24/7 team. They co-locate with our children's safeguarding teams, and they are there to speak to the officers, have an understanding of what's gone on at the incident. Perhaps they will see whether or not the children are awake, what have the children said, and this is something we're trying to focus our officers' attention more on at the moment, the voice of the child. And I know obviously you're nodding because there's been a big national rollout in relation to the voice of the child. And we're trying to get officers to have a little look and see what's the home environment like. Don't just focus on the actual domestic incident itself. What's the home environment like? How are the children? Are they engaging with you? Were they awake? I think a lot of perception is if they were upstairs in the bedroom when it took place, then they were all right, they didn't hear anything. But actually, no, we're trying to encourage officers to go up and just make that engagement with them and just say hello to them. People coming in, especially if they're big officers dressed up in full body kit and everything, body cameras, radios, absolutely everything. It's quite a daunting thing for a child to see. And so we're trying to get them to engage with them. Part of that process will then be talking to the central referral unit supervisors, having an understanding of what's gone on, what risk they're considering this to be, and obviously the supervisors then linking in with child social care to see whether or not they're previously known and is there anything else we should be concerned about there and then in terms of immediate safeguarding. If obviously people need to be removed from the home because the perpetrator hasn't been arrested, then obviously we would consider that as well. Do we need to get them somewhere, a place of safety, whether that be a refuge, whether that be friends, family? That's all taken into consideration by those officers. We also have something which is called Up Encompass, and I'm not sure, is that a national term, Encompass? Yeah. So that's something we've been using in certain parts of the county, but we're rolling it out further across the county, where we are contacting not the officers, but they are providing getting the information from the parents in relation to children's schools, and then in the morning the people from the central referral teams will be contacting the schools saying this is what's taken place at this home address, so you have an understanding. The child might come in, might be quite tired, distressed. The schools may already be aware that there is a domestic issue going on at the home address, but they might not be. So it just gives them the ability to wrap around some sort of structure for the child when they come in the next day. We obviously, as I've said, we've had the dedicated DA vulnerable investigation teams. So once the patrol units have brought the offender in, it's the DA teams, the VIT teams that then pick up the investigation. So patrols step back, they carry on doing their response calls, and then the VIT teams carry on with the investigation. We have divisional DA SPOCs. At the moment, currently, I believe they're all PCSOs. Is that right? Yeah. So our police community support officers, they will be there going out to the one-stop shops, trying to support individuals, perhaps on a more one-to-one basis, potentially where you've got high-risk victims. They might need some more individual one-to-one work, and so that's where the DA SPOCs come in. Perpetrator programs, and I will have to look so I get the name right. We obviously are wanting to try and not just focus on how we deal with it through a criminal justice system, but we want to have a look and see, well, actually, let's tackle with the actual behaviour. Putting them through a court process is fine, that's great, but actually it doesn't do anything in terms of their offending behaviour. And so there is a particular charity, and I will just check, I do apologise, but I don't want to get their name incorrect. It's the Kent Community Domestic Abuse Programme. It's called CDAP. They're a Kent-based charity, and they put on a programme of 26 weeks for people who are willing to come along and have a look at their behaviour and see if there's any way that they can actually deal with it differently. They are supported by, I think it's 4 different councils at the moment, but obviously they're a charity, so they have to have funding. They want to do more, but it's obviously difficult for them with where they can cover. I think at the moment they cover West Kent and down in Folkestone, so it's quite far apart, their 2 areas. But they want to do more, and so that's something that we're trying to engage them with, so that we can tackle not just the CJ elements, but it's another way of trying to help victims if they want to stay within that relationship. Well, actually, let's try and get that person to focus on what their offending behaviour is. We're also, as Kent Police, a White Ribbon affiliated organisation. I don't know, has anyone here heard of White Ribbon? Yeah. And so that was something that our now Deputy Chief Constable, Mr Blaker, had signed up to. And we hold events throughout the year. We try and get our officers and our staff to engage in their own personal walk of life. With aspects that they do. So I know that one young lad who works for the PCC's office does vlogs, and he is amazing. He's a real little inspiration. And he talks about domestic abuse just in terms of getting it out there, getting people to talk about it, and he is amazing. He's a really good lad. And we also have people who work or are affiliated to churches, so they have groups where they discuss it. So it's not just within the Kent Police environment, i.e. officers going out there talking to victims and perpetrators. It's about us in our everyday life trying to get that message out there about abuse by, unfortunately, it centres on males against females, because that is the main bulk of abuse. But we appreciate that obviously it isn't just men against women. So you will have seen this chart slightly earlier. Philip brought it up. It was something that, a chart that he'd come up with. Down this side you will see all the stations, the chief inspectors that were responsible at those stations for those particular districts, the briefing date, and then the go live date. Some of the chief inspectors cover 2 districts, so he tried to put those as close together as possible. However, he didn't centre, so if you think back to the other map that I showed you, Northfleet here does happen to be next to Medway, but you've got Margate up here, which is on the east, and then you have got Canterbury further down. So Maidstone is on the west, and then you've got some of the east. So he tried to, I'm trying to explain that he went across the county district by district, but not necessarily next to each other. We decided that what we should do, and unfortunately it fell on, I think it was a bank holiday, the first day that we chose to roll out. We tried to give it a week so that we would allow ourselves time to see if there were any problems. What actually took place is quite straightforward and quite basic. It's basically police doing what police do, and it's that process of officers getting out there. Officers will be told what to do, they go out and they do it. And I'm not saying, as I said to Philip, I'm not saying that all officers were brilliant and did it exactly the right time, exactly all the time. But on the whole, if you tell a patrol officer you're going out, you're going to do this, they will go out and they will do it. So Maidstone, we briefed first. I think Philip touched on the fact that part of that briefing was initially the briefing from Angie Chapman, who was the original DCI on the project. She briefed per peer group, so across the board in terms of the chief inspectors, other chief inspectors from around the county. She did a verbal briefing to them, and then that was supported by a written brief from me, which had been put together by Philip and the team. That would go out together with the briefing slide that I will show you in a moment to the chief inspectors, and that went the week before go live. So at least they understood what was meant to be coming up, that it triggered their memory, and they actually knew then that they were to go down to their teams and say, right, this is coming up, this is what I want you to do. I was then sent boxes. I was surrounded by boxes for a good 3 months. Which was amazing, was very clever, because obviously all I had to do was pick up the box and think, right, this needs to go somewhere. So they'd given me exactly the right amount of cards for exactly the right team to be sent it to. But I was surrounded. People would come in and say, what are these boxes for? And I'm like, don't ask. Secret. So I was sent these boxes. They would get sent down. I'd usually send them to the PAs, just primarily because they would always be in the station and they knew to pick them up, because things can go missing very quickly if you leave anything too long in a police station. Just goes to the wrong room at the wrong time. And there was clear instructions that they shouldn't get down to the report writing rooms until we needed them down there. And so Philip was quite precise in relation to this. I'll explain a little bit more about our briefings in a moment, but the way we would brief this normally is not how Philip wanted it briefed, because we were doing it in a rolled out phase. And so officers wouldn't normally have information passed to them in this way. So it was a little bit difficult for us to manage in terms of getting the information out there, but it worked. We managed it. So basically we did the briefing to Maidstone, gave it a week, went live, and waited then to see what would happen, to see if there was any problems. And basically, as I said, officers are usually very good. They will accept information and they'll act on it. And what we were asking them to do wasn't vastly different from what they do, because they do go out, they do give victims information, and they then hopefully will engage with that information, whether or not they phone up Oasis, whether they phone up Choices, whether they speak to victim support. They will give that information in the first instance. So the briefing slide. Our briefings at this moment in time, and certainly when this came in, our briefings were basically for intelligence only. So if we wanted to say that somebody was wanted for an offence, it would go on this briefing. If we said that somebody was outstanding for offences in relation to their registered sex offender compliance orders, that would go on this sort of briefing. Information such as this wouldn't go on our briefing. And so we had to have a little bit of a negotiation with the Chief Inspector in charge of the intelligence briefings to allow us to do this. Because ordinarily what would happen is this type of information would go on our big insight page. Everyone logs onto their machines first thing in the morning and they see their homepage, and it gives all information in relation to things that are coming up, changes in legislation, things that are happening around the county, different things that might be coming in, such as different processes. Excuse me. And so that's how this type of information would be distributed. Unfortunately, that would mean the whole county would see everything in one hit. And that wasn't what Philip wanted, because we needed to, as he's already explained, we needed to be able to see how it progressed by going and rolled out through each of the various districts. This is where a bit of learning came in for me and sorry, I said Richard earlier, I think it's Philip, sorry. This is where a little bit of learning came in for Philip and I think, because he obviously is academic. I'm not. I'm a police officer, so I know what we do and I know how we do it. And Philip, bless him, would give me information and I'd give it to our intel teams and I'd say, this is what they've come back with. And he'd go, oh, don't think I like that. And I'd say, but that's how they'll understand it. That's what the briefing teams know that officers will take in, and they'll absorb the information and do what they need to do with it. So it would go back to Philip, and then Philip would come back and he'd go, can we just move this? could we pop this a little higher? Could we move that down? Well, no, unfortunately we can't, because we've got to have the bit at the top with the blue insignia at the top. We've got to have this bit here which tells them about unity, which just keeps their minds ticking over about rah and remove the risk, avoid the risk. We need to keep those bits in there because that's what they'll be familiar with. So that's how they'll get the information in. And so I didn't appreciate, obviously, what he was doing. Don't work in that field, and he obviously didn't work in my field, so he wasn't appreciating sort of the problems that I'd have trying to get this out there. But we came to and as he said, I wasn't really happy with it, didn't really like it. He wanted it sort of side by side. We were saying no, up and down, that's the way we want it. But we came to this compromise. And basically, what would happen on the day of go live, this would be put on for the late turn patrol. Early turn would be too early because the intel package on the Monday, the intelligence teams wouldn't have been on the weekend to put this in. And so we decided that every district would go live on a late turn of the Monday. And so this would come in, late turn would come on, the sergeant for that patrolling team would stand up, they would have the brief already, and they would do what I'm doing to you now, just in relation to what the officers needed to do. So they wouldn't just get this, they would get a chalk and talk. They would say, this is what we're doing now, this is the reason we're doing it, this is what I want you to do, these are the cards here. Take however many cards. Philip had worked it out, some places had 3 cards each, some had 5, just to try and work it through on that 3-month trial basis. We had enough roughly. And that's how it worked. So the officers took the details. This slide stayed on for 2 weeks. So it then captured people who may be off sick or on rest days. At least it went through then, and basically each of the 5 patrol teams would have seen this. Something that Ma'am mentioned slightly earlier in relation to who would have seen it, and this is where our problem comes in slightly with whether or not it was put on our briefing system that goes county-wide or whether it was just put on here, was we have lots of different teams. The main bulk of our domestic abuse calls are responded to by uniform response. That's the main core bulk. You call in and the response officer will go out to you. However, there are occasions where we have teams that will respond in addition to that because response are too busy. You might get a call that's been what we call diarised, and so you will get somebody from potentially a community safety team that goes out to see you, or from a vulnerable investigation team seeing it at the front end. Now, they might not know, because it hasn't been briefed to them specifically, that this has come into play. So, for instance, you've got a response officer in Margate. They will see this Monday morning. That's great. The next patrol or the next officers to come in for VIT might not look at this until the Tuesday, because they've been on it over the weekend. They looked at it on the Friday. They know nothing new's come onto it. And so they might not actually pick up and look at this until the next day. So if they say a victim on the Monday afternoon, they won't know to give them the card because they've had to come into the front counter. So there are little nuances like that. However, the main bulk of people that would have been responding to this are the patrols, and this is how they would have got the information. The only other problem I had, and I explained this to Philip, was borderless policing. There are occasions where we have to go borderless because we don't have enough officers responding to the particular calls. And so we might have somebody who responds to a call in Margate but is actually from Canterbury. Margate went live first before Canterbury, so Margate's they've had the briefing, but Canterbury haven't. So a patrol officer goes along, does what he or she would normally do, go along, give them the safeguarding, look at what they needed in terms of alarms, referrals, CP referrals, whatever it was. They do that, but they wouldn't know about the cards for David's team. And so that was a bit of an issue for me, but again, Philip was fine, and he said, no, that's fine, because we're going to look at it through X, Y, and Z. So I said, fine, not a problem. As long as you're happy. I felt I needed to tell you, just in case. But no, he said that was fine. Again, it was that weighing up of what he knew had to happen and what I knew would happen from the police perspective. So during the phased rollout, we literally had the briefing to the senior team, so that was done by the Andy Chapman, who was the previous DCI. We sent the pack out to the district commanders, so the chief inspectors in those teams. That went out the week before, so that had the letter, the briefing slide, and the big pack of cards. And then the briefing slide went onto the briefing system on the Monday afternoon, ready for patrols to then start taking that information in. And then obviously we had the go live. During the go live phase, I would be in contact with the chief inspectors on the morning of, just to make sure everything was okay, were the cards in place, was the briefing slide on, did they have any questions? And I would invariably usually speak to the inspector in the afternoon just to see if there was any questions that they had asked, had patrols asked anything, to see if they had any questions. Sometimes they do, just any questions in relation to it, and they knew then to come back to me as a single point of contact if they had any problems. I would then contact the chief inspector the following week to find out how things had gone. And once that had happened, I then just left it for them to do. They carried on. If they had a problem, they knew they would come back to me. And then in the August, I contacted all the chief inspectors because by the time, I think it was the end of August that the rollout had pretty much finished. I think Swanley was the last station, and that was towards the end of August. And so I contacted all of the chief inspectors and I said, right, what can you tell me? How's it gone? Have you got any problems? Were there any issues with it? Have you got cards? What's the state of play? And so they came back to me. Their feedback, the briefing was clear. Everybody understood it. So all the officers that should have been in the know who were going to be responding to the majority of calls understood what was expected of them. And as I said, for them, it wasn't really anything different because it's what they were doing. But all you just needed to make sure is they were doing it. They were giving them this extra piece of information, which might be that hook that makes somebody turn around and say, actually, yes, I do want to ring them. Or when they do ring, I'll speak to them because I don't really want to talk to this officer, but actually that person might be somebody I want to engage with. They were actively giving them out. And as I said earlier, they're a little bit resourceful, officers, and they do tend to find other ways. If they run out of cards, then they've either made a note of it in their P&B and then they'll write it down on the piece of paper for them. Because unfortunately, it's not an ideal world. They might have already been out to 4 different calls that day, given out their cards, and that's it. But they'll photocopy it, they'll make sure it's written down somewhere. So they give those people the advice, the help that they would need. By the majority of victims, it was well received. People were accepting of the information. Whether they acted on it, something altogether different. There were a couple of incidents where people chucked it in the bin and said, no, thanks ever so much. But I think that's more a position of where that victim was at that time. And they probably didn't want the officer there anyway. So I don't think it was a reflection of the card or the system itself. It's just they weren't ready to receive that information. The only thing that the officers did point out, reality was, and I explained this a little earlier, is the amount of stuff they have to have with them. Obviously, patrols aren't just going to calls for DA, they're going to sudden deaths, they're going to baby deaths, they're going to RTCs. There's an awful lot of information and stuff that they have to carry around with them. Sometimes the information, their cards run out. Sometimes they don't have the ability, they don't have the places to keep all of these things. And so the one thing that kept coming back was, could we have it on just one piece of paper? Could we have it on one slide? Could we have it on just one thing that we have to carry around and we can give out to people? To make their life easier, but also to make that person's life easier that they give it out to, so they haven't got all of these things that they've got to hide or carry around with them. And so that was really the only thing that came back. But for them, it was when you went back to them and said to them, is everything going okay? Is it all right? Because that's how we wanted to get that information back. And they were like, yeah, it's fine. That's because that's what we do and we're doing it. But obviously, it's, again, that link in terms of you not understanding necessarily what I do, and certainly I didn't understand basically everything you were doing. So for us, it was business as usual. It was just, I think, probably frustration-wise, is how you get that information out to everybody that needs to get the information. People should self-brief, but they won't necessarily brief at exactly the same time, unlike response officers who sit there at certain times of the day, get talked to, have a look at briefings, then they go out and do their work. That isn't the same for all teams. And so potentially you might have had officers that respond to DA calls on their division that had gone live, but they might not have had that card with them. So that's potentially a learning thing for us. But that's unfortunately just the way we brief. and other forces might not experience the same thing. And so in reality, that was it for us. It was a straightforward process. I was speaking earlier about something that I perhaps would have done. I perhaps, if I'd been doing this without the oversight of the BIT team, I probably would have thought to myself, oh, actually, do you know what? I want to try and link in with David. I want to speak to him, find out what's going on, what's the response he's getting. Is there something that our patrols could be doing differently? That we want to then sort of try and then weave into what they're doing. But what I didn't want to do was be going to David when actually we need to be keeping it quite sterile so that actually the project runs and it's evaluated properly, rather than perhaps giving it a false reading because of things that we were engaging and doing and perhaps promoting the process. So yes, so that is how we experienced it. I don't know if anybody has any questions. Did you understand what we did?
Yeah.
Good.
Excellent, thank you, Sophie.
One thing, if I can just say, one thing that we were speaking about, Ma'am here was discussing slightly earlier, was how we could then look at this in the future as a force, how we could use it, what we could do with it. And from our perspective, we would carry on doing, we would give that information out, but actually we would want to try now, and certainly from her perspective as a strategic lead, she would want to start getting that out to other agencies as well and getting them involved, making sure that they can phone in. For us, and for the reason I think we were probably used as a police service, was because actually we get out there and we respond to calls, whereas unfortunately with health, you will have people going to an A&E, perhaps with broken bones. Maybe they're not allowed to go into the room on their own with the doctor for examination, or they don't get that opportunity to speak. And it will be more piecemeal. So they will go in, they'll find the card, take it away, but you can't monitor at what point they've taken the card and when they then respond. Whereas with us, you know at the point we've gone. You know we've gone, we've given the information, we've come back, the information's given through to the victim support team, and then they respond to it. But that's what I think we would look to try and do, is try and get then our partner agencies involved in getting that information out there. Perhaps when we see them at a crisis point, that's not when they want to get that information into them. They might accept it, but they might not necessarily want to process it through at that time. We're not always, although they want us to help, then when we do turn up and we arrest people and we start making decisions, they don't necessarily like that part of it, and so then they don't want to engage with us anymore. Whereas perhaps if you've gone to the doctors because you've hurt yourself, you've got injuries, you potentially are more receptive if the doctor says, how about this? These might be people that you can help, that can help you or get some assistance that way. But understand completely why, because we're a good barometer of how this will work. But yeah, so that's potentially how we, moving forward, will want to try and use it.